Okay, we're going to be looking at the course of World War II for the United States by looking at first the Japanese theater of war and then the European, and then we'll go back to Japan and end that war with the atomic bomb. We should note that really for the United States, this is two very different wars. You're fighting the Japanese in the Pacific. They're fighting Germany in Europe. In the Pacific, we're looking at a lot of naval activity more than the Army, and in Europe, it's going to be the Army and the Air Force. We start with the Pacific because that's where that war began for the United States with that attack on Pearl Harbor. So let's note that for the Allies, it's going to be the United States that will bear the burden of most of the fighting against Japan. In the Pacific theater of war. Now, China is an American ally as well. They have been fighting the Japanese since the 1930s, you remember. But as far as the British, the Australians, the Americans go in fighting Japan, it's going to be the American Navy that will do the brunt, and that will take the burden of bearing the brunt of most of the fighting. And that makes sense. Australia does not have a huge military force, of course, and the British, they are concentrating their efforts, of course, in Europe, trying to protect Great Britain from a German invasion. All right, so we should note that when the war began, again, December of 1941, and of course into the first half of 1942, the war is not going to go too well for the Americans and their allies because, as you see from this map, the Japanese are very quickly going to take over a large amount of territory in the Pacific, outlined here in red. And let me just run my little purple highlighter here around just to give you again a sense of the huge amount of territory that the Japanese have acquired by June of 1940. By the June of 1942. It is very clear in the first 6 months of this war then that the Japanese are on the offense and the Americans and their allies are fighting defense. The American Navy, of course, had to be repaired, beefed up, get those ships out to the Pacific. The Japanese, for the first 6 months of 1942, have a fairly easy, I guess, way ahead of them to take over this vast amount of territory, as we see in that purple outline. It's going to be, though, fairly early when the tide will turn in favor of the Allies. Again, the Japanese are on the offense, but only really until June of 1942. Because in June of 1942, the Japanese make an attempt to capture the American possession at Midway Island. It's a vicious battle, high casualties, but the Japanese will lose that battle. The Americans will be able to repel the Japanese attempt to take control of Midway Island. They will indeed turn the Japanese back, and this really marks a turning point in the Pacific War for the Americans, because after the Battle of Midway, the question is no longer will the United States be able to defeat Japan. The question becomes simply, how long will it take? How long is it going to take now for the Americans to slowly but surely push the Japanese back out of all of this territory that they've occupied, back to the Japanese home islands, to bring this war to an end. Now, Americans and their allies fully believed that to finish this war in Japan, it would be necessary for the Allies to invade the home islands of Japan. But again, you've got to first push them out of all their territory that they have acquired, that they've taken by force, before you're going to be able to do that. It's going to end up taking about 3 years for the Allies to be able to do that. But essentially, again, after Midway Island, it's no longer can the Allies defeat Japan. It's just how long is it going to take? How long is it going to take, island by island by island, to push the Japanese back to Japan, to be able then to invade the Japanese islands and win this war? against Japan. So we're gonna leave the Japanese theater of war here, the Pacific theater of war here. Again, it's going to be about a 3-year slog now for the Allies to push their way, to push the Japanese out, back to Japan. In the meantime, let's go to Europe. Because the European theater of war is a much more complex war for the United States than the Pacific. And it's going to involve much greater cooperation with their allies in Europe. Because remember, in Japan, right, in the Pacific, the Americans are bearing most of the burden of the fighting. The Americans are making the primary decisions about how this war is going to operate. It's not going to be that simple in Europe. Because remember, of course, the other allies have been fighting Germany for 3 years before, since 1939, when the United States finally comes into this war. The British have been, as we've noted, putting up a great deal of resistance to keep the to fight the Germans, to make sure that Germany does not invade Great Britain. So the United States is going to have to cooperate much more closely with their allies, specifically Britain and the Soviet Union, as this war begins. Now, when the United States gets into the war in Europe, let's just note on the map all that red space. All that red space represents, of course, Germany and its ally Italy, but also represents all the territory that Germany has occupied thus far in the conflict. And again, look just how far the Germans have gotten into Russia. They almost take control of the Russian capital of Moscow. They do take control of several important Soviet cities. And we need to know that for the Allies in Europe, it's the Soviet Union then that is bearing most of the burden of the fighting against the Germans. Because that Eastern Front, from the moment that the Germans invaded in 1941, June of 1941, the Soviet Union has been fighting the Germans. Fierce fighting all along that Eastern Front from day one. It's going to be fierce fighting all the way until the end of the war as well. But let us again note that invading Russia had been Hitler's biggest mistake, because fighting the Soviet Union will weaken the German army. Because no matter how many troops Germany sends into Russia, no matter how many casualties Russia suffers, there are always more Russians. Russia has a huge population. The Soviet army was the biggest army on the face of the earth. The Germans can kill hundreds of thousands, but the Russians can then draft more men. They can draft more soldiers, put them out there on that Eastern Front to fight the Germans. The Germans will take huge losses in fighting on the Eastern Front. And in addition, the weather is against the Germans. Because let's face it, it is cold in Russia in the winter. Brutally cold. We're not talking a little old Texas, oh, it's 20 degrees outside, it's cold. No, we're talking 50, 60, 70 degrees below zero during the Russian winter. The Russians live in it. They trained in it. They know how to deal with this kind of weather. The Germans did not. The Germans will take huge losses because of the weather conditions in the Soviet Union as well. Again, fighting Russia on the Eastern Front will drastically weaken the Germans. Nevertheless, weak though the Germans may become, they were holding their own pretty much and continuing to make progress invading and occupying the Soviet Union. So let's take a look then at the strategy that the Allies come up with. When the United States comes into the war, Franklin Roosevelt will, of course, be meeting with the leadership of the Allied nations. You're going to see several meetings of Roosevelt with the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and the Soviet Premier dictator, Joseph Stalin. And when the war begins, and the United States begins to get their troops into Europe in 1942, Stalin, the Soviet dictator, asked his allies for one thing. He asked the British and Americans to please open a second front of fighting in the West. Open up a new front of fighting in the West. The Soviets have been fighting in the Eastern Front, fighting on their own soil to try to push the Germans out. Stalin says, please, America, please, Britain, open up some fighting in Western Europe, maybe in France, to try and relieve some of the pressure on the Soviet Union. If there's fighting in the west of Europe, in Western Europe, then Germany's going to have to move some of their troops away from the Soviet Union to fight the other allies in the West. That should relieve some of the pressure on the Russians and allow the Russians then to really begin a concentrated push to get the Germans out of the Soviet Union and out of Eastern Europe. Now, this strategy makes perfect sense. Now that you've got a two-front war, it is going to be now possible to force the Germans to divide their troops. And again, the whole goal is essentially to push the Germans out of Eastern Europe, to push them out of Western Europe, and get them on back to Germany. Now, Roosevelt agrees with this request from Stalin. He says, yes, of course, we will get that second front opened as soon as we can. We hope that we can get that front open this year in 1942. But Winston Churchill disagrees. Now, again, the United States is going to have to cooperate much more closely with its allies this time. The United States is not going to be able to make all the decisions like they were making in the Pacific. And Churchill says, no, we're not ready for that second front yet. Churchill said, look, these Americans, and we're going to need them to open that second front. These Americans, they haven't had any combat experience yet. These are fresh troops, newly trained and recruited troops. We need to give them some combat experience first before we put them head to head with the Germans on the continent of Europe. Churchill suggested instead that the American troops get some experience in fighting first in North Africa, to begin pushing the Germans out of European colonies that they had taken control of early in the war, and that the Allies should fight a naval war in the beginning, that they need to fight the German Navy in the Mediterranean, in the Atlantic, try to weaken their Navy that way, and also conduct a lot of bombings over Germany to soften up Germany for the eventual European fight to come. Now, Roosevelt understood this rationale, and he agrees with Churchill. Yeah, the American troops need some experience. So Roosevelt agrees to delay the second front. Hopefully, then they tell Stalin we can get that front opened by 1943. So let us note. U.S. troops then will first see action in North Africa here, beginning in November of 1942. And my dad was one of those troops in North Africa. The Americans were pretty quickly able to overrun the Germans and push them out of North Africa. They also conducted bombing campaigns against Italy. And there will be some fighting against the Italians and the Americans over the course of 1942-43. But this is not the second front that Stalin needed, because fighting in Italy is not going to force the Germans to take any of their troops away from the Eastern Front. Why would the Germans take their troops down into Italy when you've got the Italians who can do that fighting? So no second front, not yet. The fighting in North Africa and Italy will take no pressure off the Russians, and it's going to take a little longer to get that front opened. That second front is not opened until 1944. That second front, that Western Front, will open in France On June the 6th, 1944, the date that we still refer to as D-Day, when the British, American, and Canadian troops will cross the English Channel, invade northern France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, and begin now to push the Germans out of the territory in Western Europe that they had taken control of earlier in the war. The United States forces, for example, will move down into France. They will liberate Paris and begin then to push the Germans back, to their own territory. So now we've got that second front. But we want to note, Stalin is not happy about the delay. First, Roosevelt had promised that front would be opened in 1942. Then they said, okay, we'll open it in 1943. But it's 1944 before that front is opened. And Stalin kind of thinks that the United States and Britain have deliberately delayed opening that front, that they delayed it on purpose, that it was a conspiracy, it was a plot to force the Russians to have to continually fight the Germans head-to-head on the Eastern Front and thus weaken Russia. The Germany and Russia will have fought to the very death practically, and Russia would be so weakened after the war due to that fight that they really wouldn't be able to play a dominant role in the post-war world. So, these nations are allies, but the Soviet Union still doesn't really trust their allies, and real frankly, Britain and the United States don't really trust the Soviets all that much either. But this is one of the reasons we're going to start to see the tensions and hostilities growing between the Soviet Union and the other allies that helps to lead to the Cold War. Stalin believes the Allies have plotted to deliberately delay that front, to weaken the Soviets. Distrust is beginning to grow, even as these nations are fighting together to defeat the Germans. Let's note, however, that this tactic is successful. When that second front finally does open, now as we've noted, we're going to see the Germans and the Canadians and the Americans pushing the Germans out of Western Europe, the areas that they had occupied earlier in the war. And the Soviets now are going to have some relief, and now they're going to be able to really start to push the Germans out of not only the Soviet Union, but now also out of much of Eastern Europe. And again, the whole plan is to, again, get the Germans out of the territories they've occupied in the East and in the West, get them back onto German soil, and then completely occupy Germany to be able to bring this war to an end. But let's understand that when any nation liberates an occupied country, when America liberates France, for example, as the Soviets liberate Poland and Hungary and Romania, for example, they're going to occupy those territories for a period of time. That's normal in a war. You liberate and you occupy. You occupy that territory so that you can get it back to normal. So you can start to get the electricity back on, to get law and order back in process. And for the Western allies, for Britain and the United States and Canada, they also want to organize free elections in those liberated territories so that the people of Western Europe then could choose their own government for the future. And so that process of occupation is indeed important, free elections being the final goal. What we're going to find, however, is that the Soviet Union, when they occupy Eastern Europe, they're not going to allow those free elections to happen. The Soviet Union is going to take advantage of where they find themselves at this point in the war. They have control over Eastern Europe now. And instead of allowing free elections, we're going to see the Soviet Union installing communist governments throughout Eastern Europe. communist governments that will answer to Moscow, that will answer to the Soviet Union. And so this is another piece of the puzzle, a piece of the tensions that begin to rise between the Allies during World War II. The Soviet Union will not allow those free elections to take place in Eastern Europe. Instead, they're going to establish puppet governments, governments that Moscow can control, communist governments in Eastern Europe, in order to have dominance over at least half of Europe once the war is over. All right, so, but as I said, this whole strategy will work. The Soviet Union succeeds in pushing the Germans out of Eastern Europe, out of Soviet Union, out of Eastern Europe. The other allies, the Americans and the British allies, are going to be able to push the Germans out of Western Europe. The two sides are going to meet, taking full control of Germany in May of 1942 at the Elbe River, ELBE, just outside of Berlin. Soviet Union had liberated the German capital of Berlin. And on May the 8th of 1945, Germany will indeed surrender, unconditionally surrender, to bring this war in Europe to an end. Italy, we should note, had surrendered earlier to the Allies. So May the 8th, 1945, victory in Europe, VE Day, as it's known. And let us just note that Adolf Hitler did not live to the end of the war. Adolf Hitler, who was in an underground bunker in Berlin as the Russians were barreling across Germany, Adolf Hitler made the decision to kill himself. He killed himself on April the 30th, 1945. He ordered his body be burned. He did not want there to be any remnant of him left for the Soviets to have as a trophy of war. And you can kind of understand that. Remember, he had betrayed the Soviets. He had broken that Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact. He had invaded the Soviet Union. So you can imagine the Soviets were determined that they would be the ones to liberate Berlin. They wanted to capture Hitler, but he killed himself instead. All right, with the war over in Europe, however, let's note it's still going on in the Pacific. So let's go back to Japan. Now, by the time the war was over in Europe in May of 1945, the Allies had been able to liberate pretty much all of the islands that Japan had occupied in that first part of the war back in 1941. The Chinese had been successful in pushing the Japanese out of much of China as well. So that by the summer of 1945, it really does, Japan is pretty much pushed back to their home islands, and in a sense is ready for that final assault. And again, Americans believed very strongly that it would take an invasion of the Japanese home islands before the Japanese would surrender. They do not think the Japanese will surrender without a direct invasion of Japan. They believe that the Japanese would fight in the streets, hand-to-hand combat, before they'd give up. But we should also note that by the summer of 1945, the Japanese are aware that it's about to be over. The Japanese understand that they have lost this conflict. The Japanese would like, in fact, to establish some negotiations between Japan and the United States to agree to some concessions that would make it a little bit easier for the Japanese to deal with the loss in this war. Now, let us note that the Soviet Union is not yet at war with Japan. The Soviet Union had always promised the United States that once the war in Europe was over, give them a couple of months, and they would enter the war in the Pacific to help the Americans in that final push to defeat Japan. So the Japanese, in the summer of '45, reached out to the Soviet Union, asked the Soviets to please ask their allies, the United States, if they would sit down with the Japanese for negotiations. The Americans refused. The Americans insisted on unconditional surrender by the Japanese. No deals, no concessions. The Japanese must surrender unconditionally, as Germany had, so that there'd be no questions at the end of this conflict that would need to be taken to any peace conference. So there would be no questions about whose fault this war was. The Japanese, they argued, must surrender unconditionally to bring this war to an end. Now, the Japanese wanted especially some agreement that their emperor could remain on the throne. The Emperor of Japan was almost a godlike figure, very much revered in Japan, and they believed that if the Allies would allow him to remain on the throne, that would provide a measure of continuity, a measure of normalcy that could help the Japanese to deal with the loss in this conflict. But again, the Americans refused. No negotiations, no sitting down, no agreements, no deals. Unconditional surrender. Let us also note that by the summer of 1945, the United States had developed a powerful new weapon, an atomic bomb. We should note that during the development of that bomb in the United States, Great Britain had been fully informed as to the nature of that weapon. The Soviet Union had not. Stalin had kind of been left in the dark because, again, the Allies don't fully trust the Soviet Union. And the Soviets don't know about this weapon until it was successfully tested in July of 1945. We'll see the ramifications of that in just a minute. Now, in July of 1945, then, after the successful test of the atomic bomb, let us note that there is a new president in the United States. Franklin Roosevelt had died in April of 1945 of a stroke. Roosevelt had just started his fourth term as president about 3 months before his stroke. But he did indeed die about 2 weeks before Hitler committed suicide. His vice president then, Harry Truman, had become president. And it's Harry Truman then who has to make this decision about whether or not to use this new, frightening, powerful atomic weapon. Truman decided to use it. In July of '45, after that test had been successful, Truman ordered that if Japan did not surrender by August the 3rd of 1945, that the bomb would be used. Now, they warned the Japanese. There were leaflets dropped all over Japan warning the Japanese that a weapon would be used that would inflict prompt and utter destruction on their islands. But who in 1945 could have imagined the destruction of an atomic bomb? So surrender before August the 3rd, unconditional surrender, or the United States will use this new weapon against you. The deadline passed without a Japanese surrender. And so on August the 6th, 1945, at about 8 o'clock in the morning, an atomic bomb was dropped here on the city of Hiroshima in Japan. Upon detonation, 4 square miles of the city were wiped out. Nothing really remained. About 60 to 70,000 people were killed instantly in the blast. But Japan did not surrender. And when Japan still had not surrendered 3 days later, a second atomic bomb was dropped by the United States, this time on the city of Nagasaki, with about 30 to 40,000 dead upon detonation there as well. Japan surrendered unconditionally to the Allies on August the 14th, 1945. And with that surrender, the Second World War was officially over. Now, it was a good thing that Japan surrendered when they did, because even though the United States had threatened to drop more atomic bombs on Japan if they did not surrender, in reality, they only had the 2. Any other threats were bluffs. There, of course, is the mushroom cloud that is created with an atomic explosion. Again, Hiroshima, the bomb was dropped on August the 6th, 1945. Nagasaki, August the 9th. This is the city of Hiroshima. After the destruction, after the bomb was dropped, this building here is made of iron, I think. It survived that blast. Very few buildings did. This is a Buddhist temple, in fact. Today it is, they have never repaired this building. They have never restored this building, and today it is a memorial to the victims of the first atomic bomb used in the world. These are radiation burns on the back of a survivor of the bomb. No one really knew what it was going to do to people. No one really knew at all if it would affect the environment or much of anything else. There were some scientists before they even tested the thing that feared that just testing it might suck all the atmosphere away from the Earth and kill everybody. This was a tremendous risk. A tremendous risk that was taken in using this unknown weapon. So many have questioned why the United States used these atomic bombs when Japan was on the verge of surrender. The United States is the only nation that has ever used a nuclear weapon, a weapon of mass destruction, against another nation. Why use those atomic bombs when they know that Japan was ready to surrender? You know, the Japanese have asked for negotiations. They know they've lost. And besides, the United States had been planning for the invasion of Japan to be carried out in November of 45, just a few months down the road. Why use these untested weapons against the Japanese when you know the war is going to end without them? Now, at the time, Truman justified dropping the bomb on Japan by saying that it would save American lives, that the United States would not have to invade the Japanese islands, that they could bring this war to an end quickly and save maybe 500,000 Americans from dying as a result of not having to invade Japan. And I do think that Harry Truman sincerely believed that that was true. But I also know that in all these kinds of decisions, there are many, many other things that must have been taken into consideration. And historians over the years, been, 80 years, 70 years since those bombs were used. Historians over the years have discovered many of the considerations that the American government looked at in making this decision to use the bombs. Yes, it would end the war quickly. Yes, it would save American lives. Yes, there would be no need for a U.S. invasion of Japan. But also it would justify the time and expense of creating the technology. Many believed that if Americans found out that all that taxpayer money had been used to create these really powerful weapons, but they weren't used, that there might be a lot of anger and outcry against the government. The use of the bombs would avenge Pearl Harbor. Many Americans were angry at Japan over that initial invasion of Pearl Harbor, and by dropping that bomb, in a sense, it would be revenge. It would satisfy that lust for revenge that so many Americans had against the Japanese, who they had demonized so greatly during the war. Be sure to take a look at the videos about the Japanese internment in the United States. The Japanese were certainly seen as the greater enemy in some ways than was Germany. Use of the bomb could keep the Soviet Union out of the Pacific War. Because as we noted, the Soviet Union had not yet entered the war against Japan. They had said that give us a couple of months after the end of the war in Europe and we'll join America in this final push. Many Americans, I think, were concerned that if the Soviet Union did get involved in the fighting in the Pacific, that they would take over territory, just as they were doing in Europe, that they might turn communist. And in fact, let us note that the Soviet Union did declare war on Japan in the days between the two bombs. They absolutely wanted to be officially on the victorious side when this war is over. But they did not have a chance to get in and fight in the Pacific to gain territory. And finally, many historians believe in, and I'm one of them, believe that the use of that bomb in some ways was a display of American power. It was a warning to the Soviet Union. Look what we've got. Look at this weapon we have. Don't mess with the United States once this war is over. Because again, the tensions and hostilities were already the tensions and hostilities between the U.S. and the Soviets were growing during the war. Stalin did not trust the United States and Britain. He thinks they delayed the opening of that Western Front to weaken the Soviets. The United States and the British are angry at the Soviet Union for their occupation of Eastern Europe and their refusal to allow free elections, their creation of communist governments in those nations rather than allow those free elections. Remember that Stalin had not been briefed during the development of the bomb. He'd been kept in the dark until the test, the successful test of that weapon. And so clearly, I think the Soviets saw this as a threat, because right after this war is over, the Soviet Union will begin their own bomb-making program. Not only does World War II set the stage for the Cold War, it also marks the beginning of the nuclear arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union. So to recap, what are the three things that occur during the war between the Soviet Union that contributes to the beginning of the Cold War? 1. The delay in the opening of the Western Front, creating a great deal of distrust on the part of the Soviets against the Americans and the British. They're out to get us, Stalin said. They're out to weaken us, even though we're allies. They're out to weaken us so that we can't be powerful in the post-war world. Second, the Soviets imposed communist governments in Eastern Europe. Instead of allowing free elections in the nations that they had liberated, they instead put in place communist governments, puppet governments, that will basically do what Moscow tells them to do, which gives them now more dominance in Eastern Europe, as you can see from this map. And we'll discuss that when we look at the Cold War next. And then finally, the bomb also contributes to the tensions and hostilities that leads to the Cold War. Stalin had not been informed of the development of the bomb, and I think it's pretty clear the United States used those bombs to intimidate the Soviet Union. Look at our weapons. Look what we have, and you don't. Don't mess with us once this war is over. All right, quick and dirty overview then of the course of the war and how it leads to the Cold War. This will bring us to an end of our material for our second exam. Our second exam I will put up in the middle of next week for you to begin to access. Watch for details through an announcement email. And always let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.